Hello everyone, welcome to this video on exploring corruption. So you should have watched the video titled The Business Case Against Corruption. That lays out some of the structural impacts of corruption and corrupt activities. What we're going to be doing now in this video is taking a look at some critical questions and just questioning some of the underlying orthodoxies surrounding corruption in the public discourse. So if we take three questions as a framework, so firstly, how do we actually measure corruption? Secondly, is corruption the reason for widespread poverty in the global south? And then lastly, is there a connection between corruption and culture? So if we start with the first question of how do we actually measure corruption, now this is a intrinsically difficult thing to measure simply because successful corrupt activities ideally wouldn't draw any attention or notice and leave no evidence. So we can presume that there's a large number of successful corrupt activities that occur and a smaller portion which raise suspicion, and then an even smaller portion of that which are demonstrable and proven to be examples of corruption. So measuring corruption is never going to be as simple as simply looking through court cases or using some kind of objective and completely demonstrable metric. Instead, we have to work a little bit harder to try and understand the degree and nature of corruption around the world. There is one index which is usually brought up as an extremely popular index, is actually used not just in public debates and newspapers, but also by organizations, international businesses when they may trying to make investment decisions, aid agencies when they're trying to develop aid programs, and governments as well. And that's Transparency International, a non-governmental organization specializing in corruption, who publish a corruption perceptions index, which is very, very widespread. It comes with a nice map if you were to look at it on the Transparency International's website, and it comes with a very nice, neat ranking where each country where they have data for comes with a score as well as a rank. So you can see at the moment with the 2020 index, New Zealand and Denmark come joint first, followed by Switzerland, Finland, Singapore, and Sweden. If we were to look at the bottom of the index, we see that Somalia and South Sudan come joint last. So nice and neat and looks to be very, very official and ranked in a very appealing fashion. If we look at how this is generated, we see that Transparency International uses experts, so both some academic experts and primarily business people and senior business executives with international business experience to actually assign particular scores to each country. Those are aggregated, so currently I believe there's about 13 surveys with 13 groups of people that then is aggregated into the index itself. Now, the reason why this is widely used is because it's very appealing. It takes a very complex subject and it boils it down to a colourful map and some nice rankings, but there are some fairly significant critiques and concerns over this as well that have been highlighted by some major academics and experts in the field. So firstly, there's a concern that the expertise consulted, represented primarily by business people and those with experience in international business, represents particular entrenched understandings of corruption. So what actually constitutes corruption, what constitutes the most harmful forms of corruption, and how we understand the impacts of corruption. That's coupled with the fact that there is a real lack of diversity in occupations and backgrounds. And we're not talking about gender or ethnic diversity, but rather diversity in terms of expertise. So there are some academics included amongst the surveys, but they are very much in a minority. And instead, you do have primarily a focus on industry practitioners and as I said before, international business people with a background in international businesses. Those two are drawn from a variety of regions across the world, but there is a clear majority drawn from primarily Western based multinationals in particular. So that lack of both business diversity in terms of the kinds of professional backgrounds that these experts come from, as well as a lack of diversity in terms of a relative lack of academic expertise, as well as from other sectors such as international NGOs, aid agencies, governance programs, and so on. So that's raised some fairly significant concerns. There's also a emerging body of literature. So the major study that was done in 2013 was examining Brazil, as well as there have been studies since then looking at various other countries as well, where because the corruptions perceptions index is actually used to make both aid decisions, international development assistance decisions, and also leads to some fairly significant decisions on how aid and international assistance is deployed. There's the emergence or the beginnings of the emergence of a body of literature on corruption traps, where aid that would purport to actually assist in governance structures and systems to reduce corruption are either withheld or have onerous conditions placed upon them, which results in them not actually assisting in any meaningful way. And so there does seem to be both measuring perceptions of corruption, but also shaping perceptions of corruption, which then have significant knock-on effects. As well as this, it has also been pointed out, and it is worth noting, that Transparency International is primarily funded by a combination of Western governments and multinational businesses, which again raises concerns about the entrenchment of a status quo understanding of corruption and measurement of corruption itself. This is a complex topic. It's also a fascinating one, and I would encourage you guys to go and read more on this. The major work that really started a very public discussion and debate both in academic circles and outside was by a professor of international trade and economics, Alex Cobham, in the Center for Global Development. It's a very readable and straightforward article, and is well worth exploring. That does raise the question, however, that if we're have serious concerns about the corruption perceptions index, then what can we use it? Is it actually possible to measure corruption at all? If our own understandings of corruption, the international system, economic systems, social and political systems are so embedded in this. Cobham's recommendation, and one that I do agree with, is that we do have some alternatives. So one, actually, the Transparency International partake in themselves is a global corruption barometer, which doesn't just use expertise from various business people or particular elite circles, but actually does involve a broad-based survey from citizens of the countries that are being assessed. The name is also quite significant. As a barometer, there is no nice, easy list. There's no rankings of countries or color-coded maps, but rather more detailed reports, so more of a qualitative rather than a quantitative approach. where you can actually read through various reports on different regions and get a more detailed understanding of how corruption manifests in those particular regions and countries, and how it actually is experienced by those living there. So it may not be possible to get an objective measurement of corruption that everyone can agree on, but it is certainly possible to explore different perceptions and understandings of corruption, particularly from a range of different vantage points. And that is something that the Global Corruption Barometer, as well as other similar projects, are beginning to explore. If we move on to our second of our three questions that we want to have a critical look at, the second looking at it is corruption the reason for poverty in the global south. The easy answer to this would be, well, it's clearly not the only reason, but it appears to be a reason. So we can think about exactly how significant is corruption when it comes to some of the underlying causes of poverty in the global south. Well, the headline figure can be staggering. So this is from a few years ago, but the World Trade Organization estimated about $20 to $40 billion dollars annually is actually lost to corruption globally, and the vast majority of that, the WTO estimated was lost from public finances in the global south. So Africa, Asia, Latin America being the major regions of the world. However, as astonishing as that figure appears to be, it's worth always keeping in mind that once figures reach a certain point, we start needing some kind of comparison to really put things into perspective. So a study here, quite an in-depth study by the Global Financial Integrity Institute, which specializes in this particular subject, estimated that this figure only really accounts for about 3% of total illicit outflows from public finances globally. So as huge as it appears to be when it comes to understanding why governance, political systems, and poverty seem so endemic in various parts of the global south, it certainly doesn't provide us with anything like a primary reason. You would imagine that the primary reason for poverty would account for more than just 3% of total annual outflows, illicit and illegal outflows. For a bit of comparison, about 900 billion is estimated to be lost through tax evasion and other illicit monetary flows, such as misinvoicing and other outflows that can be traced to multinational corporations and international businesses. So those two figures provide us with a bit of a comparison point to understand that to label corruption as one of the primary reason behind poverty in the global south is appealing for a number of reasons, is nice, is neat, there's potential clear solutions. There's potentially very limited amounts of structural change that needs to happen. So if corruption is one of the primary reasons for poverty, then we don't need to actually have any structural adjustments or a rethink of global economic systems. We simply need to fix the problem of corruption. But the actual data does not appear to bear this perspective out. So if we are going to consider things like corruption and domestic governance as significant issues underpinning poverty, and we certainly should, particularly when it comes to domestic governance. But then we also have to bear in mind that they are much larger and significant issues that need to be tackled to really get a full understanding. So global governance, including global economic governance, international trade patterns, as well as behavior of multinationals, international businesses, as well as historical development, which is often underplayed, but it's almost impossible to understand the social and economic reality of the global south without understanding the colonial period, which again, it may seem like this is very very obvious, but it's is worth bearing out that the very borders and constituent parts of the majority of the global south are directly the result of the colonial period. So it's hard to underplay just how important that is to understand the current state of the global south itself. And lastly, we're just going to take a brief look at a question which is always quite popular. Is corruption linked to culture? And I think this is partly due to the fact that if you're from, or if you have family links or ties to anywhere in the global south, then there's a perverse bit of pride sometimes that Pakistanis would say that Pakistan is an exceptionally corrupt country, and is down to the nature of the people. The corruption flows from the nature. I've heard Nigerians say the same thing about Nigeria. I've heard people from the Arab world say the same thing about the Arab world. It does tend to be something which is quite common. However, that does lack a bit of a global perspective. So even if we do take something like the Corruption Perceptions Index on board, so this is a map from the most recent Corruption Perceptions Index, what should be remarkable is the degree and depth of corruption as a significant problem around a huge swathe of the world. In just looking at the map there, quite clearly, huge parts of Asia, Africa, and Latin and Central America, there is very little cultural contiguity or cultural affiliation between different parts of the world. There isn't a huge amount of cultural connection between, say, Venezuela, Nigeria, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and so on. There isn't a nice, easy cultural connecting factor that we can identify. Now, there are other significant connecting factors between those countries when it comes to the very formation through the colonial era, the role that they play within the global financial system as well as the global economic system, the type of political governance systems in place, but culture isn't one of them. So the idea that corruption is something which is intrinsically linked to culture is again something which may be appealing as a nice simple solution. And again, I'm speaking just primarily even of so for the example of Pakistan is something that you will hear quite commonly said by Pakistanis. I'm sure once we get into more unsavory types of perspectives, so a perspective that certain countries are just corrupt because that's just their culture to be corrupt, that's a different kettle of fish altogether. But it still is fundamentally lacking in any kind of systematic data or even a systematic framework to take it as an actual reality. The reality is that there is almost no common cultural basis for the type of corruption that we see across the global south, and therefore the idea that corruption is somehow intrinsically linked to culture requires two things. One, that everything that we know about cultural difference is somehow wrong, and actually everyone in the global south belongs to the same culture, which flies against masses of lived experience, tons of research, and just reality. Or there are other systematic and structural causes for corruption, and culture is not really a significant unifying factor whatsoever.